All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the full stack development process. How are we going to connect everything that we've learned so far? React is going to be sending Axios requests, just like we've seen before in our React applications, where we were interacting with the Rick and Morty API, with the Game of Thrones APIs, all those different APIs that we're interacting with. We're essentially going to mimic that same behavior, but we're going to be interacting with the RESTful API that we created with Django. Um, there's a little bit of an exploration here that we can do into our API endpoints. But before we go into that, I want to go over this image here. So here's an image of what our end state is going to look at once we actually deploy our application. All right, so this is our full stack deployed app. I can share this domain or this link here with everybody on the Zoom chat. It is in our curriculum. So there it is on the Zoom chat if anybody wants to take a look at it. Essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to deploy our entire application inside of the internet and inside of an EC2 instance. In there, we're going to have an Nginx server that's going to be handling all of our API requests, or pretty much any HTTP requests that come into this EC2 instance. A server called Nginx is going to handle all of those requests, both for React and for Django. Now, depending on the request or the naming convention of the request, it's going to redirect said request to either the static files directory to render one of our React templates, or it's going to communicate with gUnicorn, which is another server that we're going to utilize to actually speak to our Python code and host our Django API. All right. And then our React application will communicate with Django if need be. So here's a little bit of the flow chart of how things work. If our components or pages have to interact with our backend, there may be some communication that happens there. But we do know that the communication between Nginx or the HTTP request will be assured to either go into our static files or into gUnicorn to render our Django API. So that's our end state of what we'll have by Wednesday. Here's the whole enchilada preview. Now let's start by talking about our full stack application. If you go into our curriculum, there is a link to the task manager repo. You can clone that and you could follow along if you would like to, or you could use it to practice. And then you could, the more you practice, the more you can grab some code and maybe reuse it, recycle to be able to do a couple of things. But here we have our backend API. In our backend API, if we take a look at our projects in settings.py, you'll see that almost everything is still exposed, right? We still have our secret key being exposed. Here are all of our apps being installed. We're utilizing REST framework with authentication. We have our list app, our subtask app, our user app. If we come down to the database, we can see that we're still utilizing PostgreSQL, but it's interacting with the to-do database. So let me open up another terminal here. Let me enter the to-do database. And if I take a look at the relations, currently the to-do database is completely empty. All right. I don't have anything inside of that to-do database, meaning that none of my migrations are applied as of now. Here's some of the configuration for REST framework. Our static file directory, which we haven't interacted with and we will not be covering during Code Platoon's curriculum, but know that if you're holding something like pictures or you're holding something like a template render that you want to show with Python being if you're trying to do server-side rendering, you're going to have to interact with this static file URL in this static files directory. And then we have our authentication user model, right? Which points to the user app. So if we go take a look at that user, here we can go into the models. You can see there's really nothing crazy here. We have our email, age, we have a display name, a little bit of a validation, some address to a text field with a default of unknown, and we have our username field being the email. all of our API views are already built. We're not starting this project from scratch. This is going to be a pickup of pretty much a culmination of everything we learned up to this point. All right, so let's get our backend server running here. Here I have my FS app, which is just a virtual environment, a Python virtual environment. I'm going to go ahead and pip install -r requirements txt. So there we can see I'm collecting everything from requirements txt. I'm going to upgrade my pip, which I should have done before. I'm gonna try to run that requirements txt one more time, but it looks like everything is good to go. And now I'm gonna apply my migrations. I'm going to change directory into my backend. I am then going to run Python manage py migrate to apply all of my migrations into my database. Now, if I go into my database and I run \d, we'll see that I have all the relationships coming in from my Django application. So there we see all of my relationships. Great. Finally, I can run Python, manage py, run server, and I can start interacting with my endpoint here. I'm going to open up Thunder Client, do a little bit of interaction. All right, so if I want to take a look at, if I want to make sure that this even works, there is the test, which gives me a 404 not found. Oh, I apologize. It's API/test. There you go. So we can see that I can successfully connect with my API. I see the test was successful. The request was rendered. It grabbed a status code of 200 and it returned a response. And it looks like it's an HTTP response with some text inside of it saying test was successful. We are connected. Good. So I know my backend framework is able to run. I was able to run my migrations from all of these different applications that I have, and I can speak to one another. And in case you're, wondering about the database structure of our models, since we don't want to go into each individual file, we can quickly take a look here. We have our user model, which connects to our list app, which then connects to our task app and subtasks. All the logic has already been built out. We don't have to worry about the logic behind this assignment. This is an assignment that we all should have already seen. Know that it is built, prepped, and ready to go. All right. Before I move on into our front-end application, does anyone have any questions regarding our back-end framework or our RESTful API with Django? Right. Doesn't seem like there are any questions. So let's move on into our front-end application. In our front-end application, inside of source, we have our pages. You'll see that I have something called utilities.jsx. We'll go into what this file is going to be used for here shortly. But here comes the meat and potatoes, right? So we have our create browser router, which utilizing a path element renders the app. We have our homepage, our sign up page, and our login page. And if we go take a look at our homepage, we can see our app hasn't really been built out at all. So we're going to be writing a little bit of React code here. We have our navbar component, and we have our app.jsx, which is one asking for a user. If that user is present, we'll see something load, and we have our outlet connecting all of our different children. So let me log in here. I'm going to change directory into my front-end application, run npm install to install that React project and its dependencies. And then I'm going to npm run dev. Okay. There you go. So there we can see our application now. We have our sign up page, we have our login page, and we have our home page. Good. Nothing crazy as far as React. It has been a while since we've seen this. So just to make sure that we understand the connection here, we have an index HTML file, which is what's being rendered here by the browser. How does this code connect? Well, we have a script here that is grabbing from source main JSX. Source main JSX is saying, hey, I want to grab the root element of this index file. So here's the root division of that index file. And inside of that root division, I want to render all of the contents of this router provider. All right. Well, my router provider is rendering the router that I created. And here I am telling it the element that you will render at this route will be my app. And that's how we get the app to show up with our navbar and our outlet. Right? So there's the communication happening within my project built out in React and my actual browser. All right. That's going to conclude our overview of both of our applications. Before we continue moving forward, does anyone have any questions regarding anything that we've covered as far as our front end project and our RESTful API? Great. Doesn't look like there are any questions. So let's get started and connecting these two. All right. So gonna go over to app.jsx. And typically what we've seen in app.jsx is, well, I want to communicate with some sort of API. I'm going to utilize this information to map through this information once it changes the state, right? So I have a list of objects. I'm going to map through that list of objects and render some components on the screen. Okay, well, great. How do I communicate with my backend server? There's really not too much of a trick to it, right? We've seen this before. Let's go ahead and make our test connection function here. And this is going to be an asynchronous function that is going to send a request. So let's say, hey, I want to await for Axios, which we don't have installed apparently. So let me install Axios. I'm going to jump the gun there. All right. So I'm going to wait for Axios. And to send a GET request. And this GET request is going to go, let me minimize that, into my backend server. So I'm going to copy that, bring it in, API/test, just like we did within Thunder Client. All right, so here's the address that I utilize for Thunder Client. It's the same exact address that I'm going to be sending this Axios GET request to. All right, and then after that, I just want to console.log response.data. All right, so there's my test connection function. I'm utilizing Axios to attempt to communicate with this API endpoint. If I go back into Thunder Client, when I send the request, it gets processed and I get back an HTTP response saying test was successful. Well, that's the same thing that I expect to see once I'm running it inside of React. Let me try to relocate this navbar here. Can't remember where that, there you are. Oh. All right, so there's my, currently I'm logged into the console. I shouldn't be seeing any user messages. Everything is cleared. And now I'm going to go ahead and send my request to that API endpoint. And I'm going to be doing this utilizing the useEffect function. Um, um, so here we have useEffect, which is a function that takes in a function. And what I want to do is I wanted to send test connection every time the app renders. All right, so let me go ahead and refresh this. All right, well, I see that in user messages, I don't have any errors. But if I go over to messages, this is what shows me everything, both my user messages and errors. It's showing me, hey, we're connected to Vite. We try to send a request, but you're getting a CORS error. All right, so CORS stands for cross-origin resource sharing. Well, if we take a look at our animation here of our full stack deployment, our React application and our Django app and our Django API are not running by the same server, right? They're being hosted by different servers. My local machine on port 8000 is hosting my API endpoint, and my local machine on port 5173, I think so, is hosting my React application. So they're not being shared by the same server. All right. I'm not doing server-side rendering, meaning Django isn't the one that's hosting all of my static files. So this communication is getting blocked. If we think back to the full stack week where we spoke about the handshake that happens between our front end and back end, right? A request gets sent saying, hey, can we talk? All right. And that request is typically answered by our server saying yes or no, we can't talk. And in this case, when we're sending this request, the first interaction that happens asking, can we talk? Well, our server is responding with no, we cannot talk. Because as far as our Django server knows, we haven't told it that it is allowed to speak to any sort of other outside resource that isn't Django. All right. Well, and the question comes, well, why is Thunder Client able to do it, but React isn't? Well, there's a little bit of extra elbow grease that the developers of Thunder Client put into it. Thunder Client and most of other API testing frameworks, such as Postman, you won't need to do any sort of configuration or any changes to your backend server to actually be able to communicate to it. It goes with something inside of the headers. I think it's within the user agent. I'm not 100% sure. But they do some work in the background to ensure that every time they communicate with the server, the response is yes rather than no. Well, how do we handle this in Django? I'm going to go over to my Django server. And what we're going to talk about now is going to be CORS, right? We have cross-origin resource sharing. Currently, my server is saying no. But how do I specify to Django, hey, if you get a request from a different origin, we are going to share information, right? Because we want this to be a public API. We don't just want our own front-end files to be able to interact with it. Maybe we want other developers to be able to interact with this API, and we want to make it public, more like the Pokey API. Well, in order to do that, we need to install something called Django CORS. And Django CORS headers. Here we go. Is something that was created to make this pretty easy, right? Again, we're going to utilize something that's more batteries included. We could create our own CORS middleware to be able to handle this. but somebody has gone and created this for us to utilize so that we don't have to necessarily create it from scratch. We could utilize this tool and then change it to fit our needs if need be. So let's get this started, all right? The first command we're going to do is we're going to run our pip install. So it's going to be pip install Django dash course dash headers. I'm going to go ahead and share that here on our questions chat as well, so that everybody has it. That's going to install my course headers. And I could either read it straight off from the website, or I can follow our curriculum. It tells me exactly how to handle this, right? It's telling me, hey, you need to make sure that even though you installed it, you include the course headers app. So it's kind of like Django REST frameworks, right? Even though I don't have an app showing inside of my project, this project does exist somewhere, and I want to include this course headers app. So I'm going to go into my to-do project, enter settings.py, go over to my installed apps, and right under REST framework, I'm going to add course headers. And make sure there is a comma at the very end. It is a very common issue that I see where someone doesn't add a comma in between their apps and then they get a really weird error. Just make sure you're always adding a comma after you add an app. All right. The next step it tells me is, well, now that you have it, this app, within this app, there is a file named middleware. And inside of that file, there's a class named course middleware. And you want to utilize this class inside of your Django middleware. So if I come down here, all right, it's telling me to install it right above the Django common middleware. So here's Django common. Now I could grab this one line of code here and paste it. All right. And then finally, the good stuff. Well, how do I tell it which origins are allowed to speak? Right. So far, we've done the communication to say, hey, we're about to tell you who you're allowed to speak to and who isn't. We're no longer using the default settings of Django to say yes or no to someone. Now, I want this to be a completely open API. You all can look at these documentations so you could see how these domains work or how you can handle the allowed sharing depending on what you want for your API. But since I want mine to be completely open, there's this course allow all origins that I want to utilize. So I'm going to come up to where all my true or false statements are. And here right under debug, I'm going to add course allow all origins. And I'm going to make this true for allowing all origins to speak to my API. All right. So let's do a quick review of what we've done here. One, we installed Django course headers to be able to configure our API and tell it, hey, this is how you're going to communicate with other resources that are not coming from our own server. We then added the app course headers into installed apps. We moved into our, into our middleware and added the course headers middleware, course middleware, right above the Django middleware. Again, there's no magic here. This is referencing to an app, the file middleware, and then a class named course middleware. So this is something already coded, and we could actually access it within a file if we wanted to, right? So I could say, hey, from course headers dot middleware import course middleware, right? And if I click on command, this is what course middleware actually looks like. All right, so here's course middleware. It has an init method that handles HTTP responses and HTTP requests. There's a call method for every time it gets utilized. We're not going to go too much into everything going on here. Just know that there's no magic. All the Python code is there and accessible for everyone if you want to take a look to see how it works. And you can also create your own middleware if you decide that this is not something that you need. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions over how to install Core's middleware? Mikkel?
How did you get to that course middleware? Yeah, how did you get there?
Yeah, so here we can see the path to it. This is an app, this is a file, and that's the class itself. So I wrote it from course headers, dot middleware, import course middleware. And then if you hover above it, I'm not sure what the keyboard shortcut is for people who are on Windows, but on Mac, if you hold down Command, you can see that my mouse turns into a pointer. When I click on it, it
Okay.
opens up the actual file,
Okay, thank you.
of course. All right. Actually, I'm just going to comment that out. That way it's in there in case anybody wants to use it later. Any other questions regarding course middleware? I don't see anything on the questions channel, and I don't see anybody raising their hand. So let's take a look at what we did here. Essentially what we've done now, by making this allow all origins equals true, we are telling our Django server that every single time it receives a request, regardless of who it is, we are always going to answer this question with yes. Hey, can we talk? Yes, we can. Great. Well, now that I've said we can talk, our server will now take a look at the request, right? Which in this case, I want to test the connection. And finally, we will get back a response stating connection was successful. All right, so I'm just gonna leave it like that since I'm running out of space here. All right, let me run my server. There we can see our Django server is running again. Node never stopped running. I'm gonna clear my messages here, and I'm gonna refresh the page. Well, now instead of getting an error, I'm getting test was successful. We are connected. And if I take a look at my Django server, I can see I received a GET request to API test. It was handled successfully, and it returned an HTTP response. I have now successfully connected my React framework with my Django API. All right. Does anyone have any questions over what we've covered up to this point? Fantastic. Let's get moving on here then. Well, now, one of the principles that we've been trying to cover here in Code Platoon, or trying to hammer as much as possible, is well, there's a couple, but there's always the dry syrup, right? That's the one acronym that I came up with. So dry, don't repeat yourself, and then syrup, single responsibility principle, right? SRP, dry syrup. We want to make sure that everything is as isolated as possible so that we're not changing code over and over again. And so let's talk about that here. Currently in app.jsx, I am sending an Axios request, but this Axios request is going to HTTP 127.0.0.1 at port 8000. Now, is that always going to be the case? If my end state is to deploy my application, this domain is likely going to change, right? I'm gonna have a different address for this place. And if I were to change the endpoints of my application, I don't want to essentially change every single detail in multiple files and directories, right? I want to isolate one single instance of the majority of the common stuff here, or of the common URL, so that I don't have to go back and manipulate it later on. Well, how do we do that? Because so far, whenever we interacted with the Poke API, we always wrote out the entire URL. Or with any API, we always wrote out the entire URL. Well, if we go into utilities, now we can actually start isolating our code a little bit more efficiently. I can import Axios from Axios. And what I can do is I can create an instance of API. Right? So Axios is actually just a class that has different methods. And one of those methods is the create method. I can create an Axios instance that is customed, right? That handles what I want it to handle. And in this case, one of the configurations that I want to add to it would be my URL here, right? I want it to have a base path or a base URL where it goes to API. All right, this is going to interact with my backend API every single time. And notice I'm utilizing the export, not export default. That's because I'm going to have multiple functions that will interact with my API inside of this utilities.jsx. All right, but I'm still exporting the actual API variable. Well, now how do I use this? Well, all I'm going to do is rather than saying I want to wait for Axios to get this information, I want to API to send a GET request to test. And then I want to console.log response.data. And we can see the same exact response is being logged into the console, right? All I did was I created an instance of Axios where every single request will be prefaced by the following URL. So now in app.jsx, instead of writing the entire request, I can just say, hey, I want you to send a request to this API /test, right? With test being the only thing that I had to add because this base URL is already part of my API instance. All right. I'm just isolating some code here. Does anyone have any questions over creating an Axios instance? All right, no questions. So let's move into our sign up function. I want to be able to sign up to utilize and into my application. We know that I have an endpoint for sign up, right? If I come up here and I go to API/users/sign up, and I go to my body and I add an email. Oh, it doesn't make that. This. And this email is fr@fr.com. And I add a password. And that password is fr. I think that's all my models is going to need. I'm going to go ahead and send a post request, try it out. So there we can see my username does not have a display name, so it came back as unknown, but it gave me back an authentication token. Okay, great. Well, how do I mimic this behavior inside of React? let's go into my sign up directory here. Gonna close app.jsx, close utilities, and I'm gonna go into pages and log into sign up. So I want sign up to be able to handle this request and be able to log in a user or create a user. So how would I capture that information, right? In Thunder Client, we saw that I utilized, oh, that's not it. In Thunder Client, we saw that I sent an email and a password. So how could I mimic that behavior utilizing React? Anyone have any ideas? Let's hear it. Gary?
You do the same thing you did with Axios just now, but do it for signup.
Okay, yeah, that's great. We're gonna have to create an Axios instance, right? Where I'm gonna say, hey, export sign up. And this is going to utilize an asynchronous function. And what this asynchronous function is going to do is it's going to await API.post to users/signup. Right, and then it's going to have a body in the request. Well, now this body should have an email key. And this body should have a password key. All right, but as of right now, we're not passing either of these into this function. So let's go ahead and grab these two from the function. Let's grab email, grab password. So that's how this response would actually work. But how would I capture the user's email and password? This here, Brandon?
You could use a form for their input.
Awesome. So let's use a form, right? We know that I'm going to need an email and password. So I'm going to need to capture that user information there. And just like Brandon said, I want a form, right? All right. All right. Well, we don't have Bootstrap installed, it seems. I'm not going to go through the whole process of installing Bootstrap just for time's sake. So I'm going to grab my form here. I know that I'm going to need an input field, which is going to be of type email. And let's say I have a placeholder of ex@ex.com. And then finally, I'm going to need an input field of type password with a placeholder of enter password. I could have a button to try to submit. Why not? Go ahead and do an input type submit, where the value will be sign up. All right, let's take a look at our form so far. So here's my sign up form, right? Nothing fancy, kind of a janky form, and that's okay. Now I want to actually be able to capture user information. So how do I capture user information with the current states that I have and the import form that I have? Let's hear it, Mo.
Yeah, create function to handle submit.
Yeah, so my function handles submit. Maybe I do an on submit here. And the function that I'm going to call is going to be sign up, which is going to pass the email and password, right? That's what we want to do here. But how would I, right now, when I type into this field, that's not updating the email that I have, right? Or when I type into this field, that's not updating the password that I currently have. So how do I change that so that it's actually updating?
Yeah, and the input. Yeah, we can create the function and we call it. Oh, sorry, we will say the event will be. I don't remember the form, but we will capture it from here from the input
Okay, so on change,
on change.
I want to do what? Set something to event.target.value,
Value. Yeah.
not validity. All right, so this one should be password. So there you go. But that's not it, right? There's a little bit more that we need to do to this form in order for it to work properly. Because if I do it this way, I'm essentially just gonna end up in an endless loop where the set email function is not going to work correctly if I start doing backspaces. So what else is missing? There's an extra attribute that's missing from these input fields. Go ahead, Mo.
Action.
Close. The last attribute that we need is actually value. And so we add the value here. In one, we'll utilize email, and in the other, we'll utilize password. All right, let's make sure this is working correctly. Let me add a use effect here. I'm gonna console log both email and password. And I'm going to do that every time the value of email or password change. So let me clear my messages here. And let's say I type in H, hello. We can see hello showing up on my terminal. If I go into the password, say this is a password. All right, so everything's working correctly. If I go into hello and I start doing backspaces, we can see that it's updating. Great. So my email form or my registration form is now completed. I see a question from Erica. Go ahead.
Do you have to make them required?
Do I have to make them required? I could, yes. We could say, is it required? It is required, yeah. I could just drop the keyword required here. And by dropping the keyword required, anytime somebody tries to sign up, it'll say, hey, these fields have to be filled out. Great call. Go ahead, Chris.
When you was typing in whatever password, it went to like a dot format. How did that happen for, or what's the code for? Yeah. Or did you just put a dot there, or is that actual numbers that you put in, or whatever you put in?
Yeah, it's a great question. Every time you write an input field, if you set it as type password, it will hide the password being written and represent it in dots.
Got you. Thank you.
Of course. All right. So now let's take a look at our function here. All right. In my function, I'm going to send a request, and I'm going to grab the response of my request. I now pass in email and password successfully, and that will get sent to my backend directory, right? Just like we did here. And we know that my response will return a user and a token. All right. So now we have a bit of an issue, right? Because I can set the user to unknown, as we saw in the app JSX. I can easily set it to unknown. But what about this token? How do I retain the token? Well, if I utilize something like a use state or a use outlet context, what would happen when I refresh the application? Let's hear it, Brandon.
You're gonna lose the token if you refresh the application.
I would
'Cause
lose
it-
everything, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. We lose the token, my user would have to sign in again. And that just doesn't give us a good user interface, right? Or even a good user flow to begin with. Imagine if you were trying to do something like Amazon or you were in Facebook and every single time you press the backspace button or you refresh the application to try to get a new post, it forced you to sign in again. Not what we want, right? It's less than ideal. So we need a place to store this information, which is our token, that will persist outside of our React code. Well, we haven't talked about this yet, but what's rendering my React code? Right here on the internet, what's being rendered, or what is actually rendering my React code? Let's hear, Mo.
Are you talking about the header and the caching?
No, we're not there yet. I don't think we're actually going to cover caching, but that might be a good idea to add. What's being rendered by our React, or what's rendering our React code, is actually my browser, right? My browser is sending a request to Node or my Vite server, and it's saying, hey, I need an HTML file for me to render. Right, so my browser is rendering my React code. My browser is sending a request to Vite for static files. All right. Well, if my browser is sending the request, my browser is likely a place that I can utilize to hold information. Right. So if I come back over here to GitHub, I inspect this file, and I go over to application. Here we have something called local storage. And in local storage, you can see that I have a lot of information, or GitHub has a lot of information that it's deciding to hold here in local storage. And it looks like most of that information just has to do with versions of different repositories that I have access to. So here we can see a couple of references to some of our old curriculums. Right, so these are all references and they're being held within GitHub. For whatever reason, they decided, hey, this needs to persist throughout the application, but it doesn't need to go away, right? And this needs to persist within the application. And if this individual were to refresh the browser, this needs to stay, like it can't go away, right? If I refresh it, you'll see the entire application re-rendered, but nothing within my local storage changed. Well, what else works that way? HTTP cookies also work that way, all right? We have cookies that handle things like my authentication. So here's my user session. This is how they know that I'm currently active and what I'm doing, right? If I refresh the page, my cookies are being updated, right? But my local storage is never changed. And we'll go further into talking about cookies here in the following days, as far as how these are set and why they're being refreshed. But as far as development goes, it looks like local storage might be the answer for storing this token and ensuring that it persists throughout the application. Well, how do we do that? All right, once I send this request, my API is going to process the request and send back a token, but I need to make sure that this token finds its way into my local storage. So how do I make that happen? I'm going to go into utilities here. And this response .data is going to come back with two things, the user and a token. So first I'm going to check if the response was successful. So if response.status is equal to 201, meaning something was created, I want to grab both the token and user from my response. So I'm going to say, hey, let user and token be equal to response.data. All right. Please don't be confused by this. This is just object destructuring inside of response.data. We're getting back an object that holds a user key and a token key. And we're just grabbing those and setting them to a variable all in one line. Right? This is the equivalent as me saying, hey, let user be equal to response.data.user. All right, I could do it this way as well. No, it works exactly the same. Just to write cleaner, more efficient code, we're going to utilize destructuring. Right, so response.data, we're grabbing the user token. Well, now I want that user token to go into local storage. This is actually very common. So JavaScript gives us local storage, and it gives us a couple of methods that we can interact with. In this case, I want to store the token and the value of token. So when this gets processed, the key will be token, and the value will be our actual token that's coming back from our API. All right, so now we handled our excuse me, where we're storing our token. But what about our API, our Axios instance? Because we know that when we make follow-on request, well, we need to make sure that headers has an authorization header with the correct value. So how do we add that to API? Right? If I go here into my base URL, I can do something like, hey, I want you to have headers, and these headers should have authorization, and then they should have my token, right? But I don't have a token yet. My user needs to be able to sign up to get this token. All right. Well, since I can't do it at the beginning, I have to add this configuration once my user actually signs up. Now, the way I do that is I go into defaults. From there, I want to enter headers, and I want to utilize a common header. In this case, a common header would be authorization. And just like I would in Thunder Client, I would add an authorization header. And then here, type in token followed by the token. Well, in utilities JSX, I would then say, hey, I have a token. I'm using string interpolation here to add the value of the token response. All right. So now I would have a token added. I can return the user itself to my application. And if my response didn't work correctly, well, I want to alert something like, hey, credentials failed, and I could return null. All right, so there's my sign up function. We haven't seen it in action yet, so I'm gonna wait to do the overview until we see it in action. Let's go into my app.jsx because there's something that I need to pass into my outlet. I want to make sure that my user is accessible. So I'm going to pass this in context. So I pass in user and set user. Let me take a look here. I'm going to go to app.jsx. Nope. Homepage. There you go. And I'm going to grab that username. I just want to see him populate inside of my homepage. All right. So finally, inside of signup, well, I can't just call this information anymore because now I actually need a way to set it. So I'm going to say const set user. I'm going to grab this from use outlet context. And then I'm going to create a function that will handle my submit. So I'm just going to say const handle submit. This is going to take in an event. I'm going to prevent the default behavior of my form. And then I'm going to make an asynchronous function, right? Oh, excuse me, this should be asynchronous. Well, now I want to set my user to the awaited response of sign up with email and password. And now I'm going to change this on submit method to utilize my handle submit. All right. Let's take a look at our form. Let's see it work in progress. So in form, I'm going to go ahead and create a user called example. And its password is going to be EX. Well, when I click sign up, we can see the options request here. It's saying, hey, can we talk? We say, yes, we can talk. We receive a post request that goes to API user sign up. It returns a status 201, meaning a user was created. When the user is created and it returns a status 201, it triggers our if statement there. We grab our token and our user out of response.data. We can see that a token and a key of that token has been set to our local storage. That's happening from this line here. So in local storage, we set an item where the key was token and the value was the token itself. We moved into our API headers to be able to grab that token and place it under the authorization. And then we returned that user. Well, if I go to home, we can see now it says homepage unknown. Unknown is the display name of my user. Since this if statement was triggered and this return statement was processed, the remaining code was never activated because this return statement killed our function. And that is how a user can sign up to our application. Does anyone have any questions regarding the sign up process for a user? Let's hear it, Gary.
Can you real quick look at the where users get displayed in homepage, and then also where does local storage actually store the data?
So by handling this, so here's homepage. We're calling the user. That user is coming from use outlet context because we passed it as context. As far as your second question, when I utilize local storage, it goes into this application tab. Inside of application, you'll see a local storage here. And if you click on the local storage for HTTP localhost 5173, it will show you the value that you are storing. Does that answer your question, Gary?
Yeah, so is that the cookies you're talking about, or is that like actually on the machine where the data is at?
No, so this is being stored in the browser, right? The browser is holding on to this information, not the machine. So to give you an example, if I were to open up Safari, oh man, and I go to localhost 5173, you'll see this one just says homepage. And if I inspect the element here and go into the storage tab, local storage, you'll see that there's nothing there, right? But I could sign up a separate user here. So ax@ax.com and send ax. Well, now a different token is being generated for a different user, and that's being held within this browser, right? So the browser of Safari is holding that token, whereas the browser of Chrome is holding this one. Does that answer your question, Gary?
Thank you.
Of course. Brandon?
Could you give some more examples of other things that you would want to store in local storage aside from the token?
Yeah, so another thing that you would want to install there would be, let's say you have a preference for dark mode or light mode, right? Well, you don't necessarily want to handle, you could handle it within the server, or you could just have it be default, where if the user is already signed in, you need a place to be able to find that information without putting the extra stress on your browser, right? And it's going to be handled by your static files anyway, because it's essentially just deciding which CSS style sheet it should be applying into the application. So you could just put here something like theme, and then the value could either be dark or light, right? And then depending on which one of those happens, it decides which style sheet to render for the application. Let me see, I'm trying to think of another one. Another one would be like user metadata, but that might go into a little bit of a rabbit hole. I'll have to think of some more cleaner examples rather than coming up with them off the top of my head, Brendan. All right, any other questions? Okay, we've been going on for quite a bit. I don't want to go into the sign in and all the other different endpoints that we have to cover without giving us a pretty good break. So let's go ahead and take a 15-minute break and come back at 10:20 to continue on with our lecture. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, everyone. We have a sign up function installed, and it's actually able to communicate with our API and return a token, right? We're able to store that token inside of HTTP localhost 5173 inside of its local storage within the browser. This is great. Well, what about a sign-in form, right? Because so far we have our ability to sign up, but what if I want to just sign in? Well, let's start going into signing in. And actually, sign-in's gonna look pretty similar, right? All it's going to ask is for the email and password. Rather than response 201, it's going to check for response 200. And it's still going to conduct the same exact functionality. So maybe there's a little bit of change that we can do to our function to make it reusable. I'm going to leave that as a challenge for everyone here in the class. You know, if this sign up and sign in functions are so similar, there's got to be a way to manipulate this code so that you can use the same function in two places rather than rewriting over and over again, right? So this should be going over to login. So there's another change. It's our endpoint should be changing. Our status code should be going to 200 rather than 201, but the remainder stays the same, right? So there's our sign in function. Really not much of a change other than the naming and our API endpoint and our status response. Great. Well, there's our function for being able to sign in. But how do we implement this? Well, if we take a look at login JSX, it also doesn't look like it has much of a change for sign up. Right? I could technically grab all of sign up here, with the exception of this use effect. And I can grab my entire form, copy it, go to login. Take this fragments. Or I can make this log in instead of sign up. And then finally, I just need my functions, right? So I could go to sign up. Again, grab all of these functions here. Bring it over to login. And it looks like we need to import useState. And we need to import sign in. And finally, we need to import use outlet context. All right, with the only change here is rather than sign up, I want to utilize sign in. That would be it. All right, well, let's take a look here. I'm gonna get rid of my key. Gonna go over to login. We'll see that pretty much nothing changed with the exception of this H1 tag is now saying login. And I can log in. We can see that it gets processed as a post request that went to users/login. It returns a status code of 200, and our token is being stored in local storage. So this also worked perfectly well. All right, I see a question from Mickey. Let's hear it.
I was just wondering if you want to keep those both on the same page, you can just add a second button with the function. So you can either click log in or sign up. So it's the same fields. You've just got two different buttons to select from, right?
You could do that, yeah. You could also
Okay.
do something where it's like, hey, if you already have an account, click on this checkbox, right? And then that way they're signing in, or if they need an account. There's a little bit of logic and quite a bit of different ways to do it, but it's definitely possible to turn this into a component and then utilize it that way.
Yeah. And if you want them to, you can just put an if statement in there for if they click to sign up, but there's already that email's already been used or
Right, yeah.
that
You
account already exists, right?
Yeah, you could definitely go into you could do it either on the front end or the back end. I would recommend doing it in your back end framework where you could utilize maybe one API view for both registering and logging in, right? So like, hey, if this user doesn't exist, then just register him. But it kind of depends on the way you want to design your API. Awesome. All right. So now that we have this information, we're able to log in. We're able to sign up. Here we can see that my homepage unknown is still working. Inside of homepage, I can still see the user, right? Well, now that I have this token being stored somewhere, well, it does help me with the fact that I can move in between pages and I know where the user is located. But notice that when I refresh the page, my user is gone. I still have my token, but my user is gone. Well, that's because I don't have any sort of logic to confirm that there is a user for this token, right? And usually we reference this as our information request. So let's start implementing that functionality for information. So I'm going to go into utilities, and I'm going to make a different function. I'm going to export const when I want to confirm my user. This is going to be an asynchronous function. And it's going to grab the token straight from local storage. I'm going to get an item from local storage. And I will do this utilizing the key of token. All right, so that will get me this token that's inside of my local storage. I can then say, hey, if there is a token, meaning that it is not undefined, then I want to actually confirm my user. But otherwise, I want to return null. All right, well, if there is a token, I want to send a request to users. And I apologize, but every time I restart this, right, or I refresh the page, my API instance is also refreshed. So I need to ensure that I add my common header of authorization again. So again, I'll utilize string interpolation to include the token. And then finally, when this comes back, I can return response.data.user. Oh, and I forgot the await keyword there. That's why we get this weird syntax. All right, there you go. All right. So there's my confirm user function. Pretty simple, all right? But there's a little bit of a trick to this. I want to confirm that there's a user, not after my application renders, but before, right? If my user is inside of their messages or inside of some tasks when they refresh the page, I don't want them to be sent all the way back to the home page because, we're waiting for this information to process. While it's waiting for the information to process, it runs a condition saying, hey, is there a user? If there isn't a user, then when they need to go to the sign up sheet. It makes things a little bit more complicated if I wait to confirm that there is a user until after the application loads. So this functionality needs to happen before my application is being rendered by the browser. Well, how could I do that? All right, because so far, when we send requests, we usually utilize useEffect to send these requests. All right. But I want this to happen before app even renders. Well, router gives us the capability to do this with something called a loader function. So a loader function means, hey, I am going to conduct this function, whether it's asynchronous or not. And here I can get an error here, request failed with status 405. Method not allowed, which if I go to my utilities, what did I send? I sent a get. Interesting. Why did that happen? I have to look into this error real quick. I apologize. Let's see. Since the defaults, let me go into my Python code, into my user app and views. All right, so there's my sign up. Here's my info. Oh, well, there you go. There is a put request, but there is nothing for a get endpoint. So that's why I'm getting that method not allowed. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do a get here, add myself and request. And I'm just going to return request.data.user. And this is going to be a response that has the user element. Wow, I am making a mess here. I apologize, everyone. There we go. Dot display name. I think that's what the attribute is called. Let me check here. Yep, there it is. Display. All right, so that will return my user. Okay, now if I go into V and I refresh it, dict object has no attribute. User request dot go dot user. There you go. All right, so now it's working. I apologize, everyone. So now it's able to send it, grab the request for that user, and return that user's display name. All right, so now that my router does that, it's able to use this confirm user function. So pretty much anytime I refresh it, the first thing it does is it sends that request. It's asking, hey, is there a token in here? If there is a token, I'm going to set it to the default headers of this API, and I'm going to send a request for users. And then I'm going to return this data. But once this data is returned, how do we utilize it within app.jsx, right? Because currently my user is set to null. Well, I can utilize it within app.jsx by saying I want to use the loader data. And this is coming straight out of React Router DOM. And now we can see that unknown populates. All right. So there you go. Let's draw out our communication here. All right. So browser. Sends a request for HTML templates or static files, i.e. JS, CSS, HTML. All right, so that's step one. From there, that goes into our React code. Our React router sends a request to confirm the user. If a token is present within local storage. All right. From there, our Django API accepts request and returns a response with the correct user data. And then finally, just gonna put this here. React router sends data into homepage and returns homepage as the static file to render for the browser. And then that goes back to the browser. And actually, instead of having it there, I'm gonna go ahead and bring this browser back down here. So browser receives HTML template to render and shows content for user interface. All right, so that's kind of where we're at here. Our browser, whenever we go to 5173, it sends a request to Vite saying, hey, I need a template to render. Vite then speaks to the React router. The React router says, well, I need to confirm that there is a user before I load anything because that is my loader function. So it sends a request over to Django. Django accepts this request because we have our Django course saying that we are going to accept all. And it returns a response. Once that response comes back, it goes into the React router, where the React router sends the data from confirm user to app, and we're able to access that with useLoader data, which will either be null or the actual user's name. And once this is all completed, well, then app gets sent to the browser, so that the browser can actually render my page. And that's our entire full stack application flow up to this point. Does anyone have any questions over what we've done up to this point? All right. I don't see any questions, so let me just quickly review the code here. Again, in the router, it's going to call the confirm user function. That confirm user function is going to check if there is a token. If there is not a token, it's going to return null for no user being present. If there is a token, it's going to set said token as the authorization header, send a request to get the user's information, and return response.data.user. All right. From there, our homepage will my app will utilize that loaded data as the initial state of user, which then gets passed within the outlet context, and that's how it gets rendered within the homepage. All right. Our last step when it comes to user authentication is going to be being able to log out. All right, we've talked about all this different functions for being able to log in and confirm that there is a user, but we haven't talked about logging out. So let's go into that. I'm going to export const logout. I'm going to make this an asynchronous function. And I'm going to let response be equal to await API.post. This is going to users/logout. Now, when this gets processed, my status code that returns is a 204. So I'm going to check if response.status is equal to a 204. Well, only when that is successful, I want to remove. Oh, why are you failing? What's going on here? Local storage dot remove item token. And once I remove that item from the token, I also want to remove it from my headers inside of my API instance. So I'm going to delete API.default.headers.common authorization. Finally, this is going to return null. And if this doesn't work, I want to alert the user that something went wrong during logouts. All right. Well, I have this logout function or this logout button here that I can utilize to trigger this information. So I'm going to go over to my components inside of my navbar. Here is my button, which is of outline danger. So I can just simply send an onClick function that calls logout. And I don't believe I exported. Export const. Okay. Maybe we're getting a little bit of a weird reaction here. All right. So now let's take a look at our full process. All right. When I click on my navbar and click on logout, we can see unknown has been sent. A little bit of a weird reaction because unknown stays here. Well, that's because we never passed the set user function. So let's pass that into our navbar. where set user will be equal to set user. We're passing it down as a prop. In my navbar, I will now grab set user. And what I can do here, let's see. I'm gonna actually have to make an asynchronous function. Just gonna call this handle click. And make this equal to an async function that will set user to await log out. All right, so let me refresh this. We can see there's no token. Our browser was rendered. I can go into signing up. I'm gonna sign up some random user here. All right, a token is generated. If I log in, the token is still there. And if I go home, we can see that unknown still shows up. If I click on logout, well, logout is now gone. I'm getting some weird behavior regarding my logout function though. Set user. Oh, I know what it is. I apologize. And that is happening within my home. And it is happening because of the way I am calling user. I am not running it on a conditional statement. So let me go into home here. And the way this should be utilized, it should say user and user. So let me refresh that, go over to login. Here I want, I think it was ca@ca.com, ca. I log in, I can go back home. There's my homepage unknown. And when I click on logout, I seem to be getting an error. Cannot read properties of undefined headers. Interesting. That's where the issue is happening. I apologize, everyone. Okay, let me try one more time. ca@ca.com, ca. That login should have worked. If I go to homepage, it worked. And if I click on logout, I am now logged out. And now if I go into my application tab, we can see that there is no user token. So there's my full user workflow, right? I'm able to log in, log out, register, and I'm able to confirm that there is a user within my application. All right, at this point, before I continue into the actual application flow of the user, does anyone have any questions over how we implemented those login and logging out methods? All right, doesn't seem like we have any questions. So the very last thing that we need to do is handle the user interface, right? We don't want our user to be able to go to sign up or log in if they're already logged in. And if our user is logged in, we don't necessarily want them to be able to go to the homepage, right? Maybe that's the way I have my app set up, where there is no homepage. You either log in or you get nothing. So how do I implement that functionality? Well, I could implement that with one, conditional rendering within the navbar, and two, handling where the current location of the user is with an app.jsx. So in app.jsx, I'm going to create a function here. I'm going to say, hey, well, I want there to be a use effect that is going to be triggered every time the location path name or a user change. And here, let me go ahead and console.log both of those. Let's go over to console, empty it all out, and refresh it. All right, so here we can see there's my path. My user is null. If I go to login, we can see that my path is now login, and I could sign somebody in. Now we have a user and the path. If I go over to sign up, I still get user and path, etc. Right, so now there we have it. Well, now we could run a little bit of logic, right? So we can have null user URLs. This is locations where null users are able to be located, which is either inside of login or inside of sign up. So there's my array of the two locations where null users can be allowed to enter. So now I can say, hey, let is allowed. I'm just gonna say null allowed instead. So null users are allowed to be here if null users URLs includes location dot path name. And here let's console.log null allowed. So we can see what that's returning. This is returning true or false, right? So a null user should not be able to be in the home page. So that's why it's returning false. If I come over to login, well, now we can see that it returns true. And same thing if I go to sign up, it returns true, right? So now I'm able to determine, hey, is this path something that a null user should be located in? Well, now I can check, hey, if there is a user, so if my user is not null, and I am within null allowed, well, then I need to navigate. And I need to import that. So let's const navigate be equal to use navigate. All right, I need to navigate this user because he's not inside of a place that he should be back to the home page. All right, well, else if there isn't a user and the user is not in a place where they are allowed, so meaning that returns false, right? Then I need to navigate the user back into login. All right. Well, let's take a look here. So currently my user is null. If I try to go home, we can see that it returns me into login because my user is null. I can go into sign up and I can also go into login, but it does not allow me to go home. No matter how many times I click it, it won't allow me to go home. If I try to go home utilizing just the URL, something interesting happened here. Let me take a look here. Oh, I do have a token, that's why. Let me go ahead and remove that. All right, if I try to go into login, we can see that fails. All right, it won't allow me to just go straight back to the index. No matter how many times I click on home, it won't send me home. Okay, good. Well, let's log in a user now. I'm going to go to ca@ca.com and then ca. Well, now that that changed, it took me straight to my home directory. And if I refresh, it takes me straight back home. If I try to go to sign up, it fails because it says, hey, there is a current user. You can't do that. And if I try to go strictly to sign up, I get the same behavior. Right? So now my user is locked. The URLs that my user and no users are allowed to visit have now been locked. Again, I have a no users array, checking where the current user is located by location.pathname. If this evaluates to true, well, now I can say, hey, if I do have a user and they are within one of these URLs that only no user should be, I want you to navigate them back home. If I do not have a users and they are not within one of the URLs that they should be, I want you to navigate them to login. And this happens within a use effect that is keeping an eye on both the location path name and the user. Finally, well, if we have that locked down, then we should also apply that within our navbar. And that should happen within a conditional statement. All right, so I can come over to app.jsx, pass in the user and set user. Oh, that's not the way I do that. I apologize. All right, so I'm passing in the user and set user. I can then grab user as well. And I can run some conditionals. Well, if there is a user, then I want you to render home. Otherwise, if there's not a user, I only want you to render the navbar toggle. And I'm actually going to take this button here. This needs to turn into a React fragment. All right. Let me move that outside of the container. Navbar collapse, navbar collapse. Boom. All right. Oh, that's why that's there. All right. Let me grab this navbar collapse here, or excuse me, this navbar toggle. And that needs to get moved in here. All right, so there you go. Now I have my conditional rendering as well when it comes to users being able to enter my application. Right? They don't have the option for other links. When they log out, they go straight into the login function. And when I log in, I can log in and it takes me straight into the home page. And that is it as far as our full stack application for today. We were able to successfully log in, log out, register a user, and work on the user flow when it comes to authentication. At this point, does anyone have a question over any of the material that we covered today? Let's hear it, Eric.
As far as building out our own projects, would you recommend authentication on the front end and back end be the very first step we take?
Yes, I do. Definitely recommend starting with authentication. Typically, the way that I do projects, or the way that I like to think about project structure, is I start out by drawing everything. All right, so all of my different pages or my React front end. So I go planning / drawing front end, because by doing so, I can then start laying out data needed to create components. Right, so I draw my front end. From there, I can say, oh, well, in order for this to work, I need this information from my backend API. And by laying out the data that I need from my components, well, then I can use that data to create my database schema. All right, and then from there, I do kind of like the hamburger method. So now that I have my database schema, I can create code Django ORM. Right. After coding my Django ORM, I can code my Django model view controllers, which are my API views. And then once my API views are completed and everything was mapped out, well, now I can start coding React frontend. All right, so I kind of do like this whole hamburger method thing where I start with the front end and I end with the front end. So those are my burger buns. And then I just work my way slowly to the meat and potatoes, or the meat, which is my database in Django ORM. Does that answer your question, Eric?
Yep, thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? All right, if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here.